Ancient history is filled with punishments designed to enforce power, obedience, and fear. Among them, one method stands out not because of spectacle, but because of how slowly it unfolded. It was known as scaphism, a punishment attributed to the ancient Persian Empire and recorded by Greek historians who struggled to believe it was real. Unlike executions meant to end life quickly, this punishment was designed to prolong existence itself. The goal was not immediate death, but endurance. Time was the weapon. The Persian Empire, one of the most powerful civilizations of the ancient world, ruled over vast territories. Maintaining control required more than armies. It required reputation. Scaphism became part of that reputation, not as a common practice, but as an ultimate sentence reserved for betrayal. Most of what we know comes from Greek writers such as Plutarch and Ctesias, observers from outside the empire. Even they admitted that what they recorded sounded exaggerated. Yet the consistency of the accounts suggests a method carried out with intent, planning, and ritual. The name scaphism comes from the Greek word scaphe, meaning a hollowed object, such as a boat. The punishment involved two wooden vessels fitted together, forming a confined space where the condemned person was restrained and left exposed to the elements. Food was provided not out of mercy but necessity. Survival was required for the punishment to continue. The body, unable to move or escape its environment, slowly deteriorated over time due to exposure, illness, and natural forces. Death, when it finally arrived, came after many days. One name appears repeatedly in historical records: Mithridates, a Persian soldier accused of betraying King Artaxerxes II. According to Plutarch, Mithridates endured this punishment for 17 days. His case became the most cited example of scaphism and shaped how later generations understood the practice. What made this punishment especially feared was not just the suffering involved, but the message it sent. Scaphism was rarely used because it didn't need to be. The threat alone was enough. Enemies and traitors reportedly chose suicide over capture, fearing what awaited them. To modern historians, scaphism raises difficult questions. How much of these accounts were exaggerated by rival cultures? How often was it truly used? And where does history end and legend begin? What is certain is this: scaphism represents an ancient understanding of punishment that focused on psychological terror as much as physical consequence. It was designed not only to punish the individual, but to echo across borders and generations. Today it remains one of the most disturbing examples of how power was enforced in the ancient world, not through speed or efficiency but through endurance, fear, and time. Under the relentless Persian sun, the punishment truly began. The condemned was left exposed, restrained between the boats, unable to escape the heat or the environment around him. What made this method especially calculated was that nothing about it was accidental. Every element served a purpose. The substances used were chosen carefully. Sweet foods attracted insects from miles away. The forced feeding ensured the body continued functioning, which prolonged survival. The confined structure of the boats was designed to prevent immediate death while also preventing movement or relief. This was not chaos. It was control. The Persians understood balance. Too much pressure would end life too quickly. Too little would allow escape. Exposure alone could kill within days, so the body was positioned in a way that slowed dehydration and delayed fatal shock. Their objective was never speed. It was duration. This punishment was meant to last weeks. The location mattered as well. Rivers, marshes, or stagnant water ensured constant exposure to insects and environmental stressors. Anyone passing by could see the victim. This visibility was intentional. The punishment was not private. It was public theater. Historical sources describe how people gathered at a distance. Not soldiers but civilians, families, onlookers. The empire allowed this because fear spreads faster when witnessed. The lesson was clear: betrayal does not end quickly. Ancient writers recorded that survival typically lasted between 15 and 17 days. Some perished sooner due to shock or infection. A few endured longer. One name appears again and again in the records: Mithridates, whose endurance became legendary, not because it was admired, but because it demonstrated how far the punishment could go. Accounts describe the passage of time as the true weapon. Days blurred together. Physical exhaustion combined with psychological collapse. The body weakened gradually, not suddenly. Death came not as a moment, but as an outcome. Those responsible for maintaining the punishment reportedly returned daily. Their role was not to hasten the end, but to ensure continuation. Food was given. Survival was enforced. Mercy was intentionally withheld. By the second week, the condemned was no longer viewed as an individual. The body had become part of the environment it was placed in. Ancient historians describe this stage not in detail, but in tone, a point where even witnesses struggled to continue watching. What ultimately ended life was not a single cause. It was a combination of exposure, exhaustion, illness, and systemic failure. This made the punishment difficult to categorize even in ancient times. It was not execution in the traditional sense. It was deliberate decay. Scaphism was rarely used, but that was the point. It didn't need repetition. The stories alone were enough. The threat carried more power than the act itself. Other civilizations of the ancient world used public punishment, but even they regarded this method as excessive. Greek and Roman writers expressed disbelief, not only at its cruelty, but at its precision. This was not emotional revenge. It was policy. Today, historians debate how often scaphism was truly carried out and how much of the surviving accounts were amplified by rival cultures. But there is no debate about one thing: its reputation reshaped how ancient punishment was understood. It remains one of history's clearest examples of how power was enforced not through speed, but through endurance. Not through secrecy, but through display. And not through chaos, but through calculation. By the later days of this punishment, the psychological toll became the most devastating element. The condemned was kept alive deliberately, fed and hydrated, while the environment, the exposure, and the passage of time worked together as instruments of suffering. This was not chaos, it was meticulous design. Historical records suggest that by around the 10th day, the prisoner would be physically exhausted, disoriented, and trapped in a relentless cycle of survival. The human mind, deprived of normal stimuli and faced with constant stress, begins to falter. Ancient sources describe how those subjected to this punishment experienced confusion, hallucinations, and deep despair. They pleaded for relief that would not come, seeking solace from divine forces or calling out names of loved ones, only to find that no help was coming. The executioner's role was equally taxing. Observers of this method were often overwhelmed by the sheer duration and relentlessness of the punishment. Historical accounts note that even the individuals tasked with maintaining it sometimes requested transfers, preferring the dangers of the battlefield to the unending demands of this process. Witnessing someone endure prolonged suffering over weeks created what modern psychology would recognize as post-traumatic stress. Soldiers could not watch the full course of punishment. Rotations were necessary to prevent total breakdown. Mithridates, the Persian soldier whose betrayal led to his capture, became the most famous case. According to records, he endured 17 full days under this extreme protocol, the maximum documented survival time. By the later stages, he was no longer able to communicate clearly, and the executioners approached with caution, aware that the process had pushed both the victim and themselves to the limits of human endurance. It is important to understand that this was not improvised cruelty. Scaphism was deliberate, calculated, and refined over generations. The Persians studied outcomes carefully, measuring survival, timing interventions, and ensuring the process would achieve its psychological and political purpose. 17 days was not arbitrary. It represented the perfected duration designed to leave a lasting impression on witnesses and instill fear throughout the empire. The punishment functioned as a powerful deterrent. Reports indicate that Roman soldiers would rather commit suicide than risk capture, and Greek spies carried poison to avoid falling into Persian hands. Enemy generals sometimes negotiated specific clauses to prevent this method from being applied. The fear alone shaped military and political behavior across regions, illustrating the Persians' sophisticated understanding of psychological control. Scaphism did not merely punish an individual, it broadcast a message to all who might consider treachery. By combining visibility, duration, and controlled deprivation, the empire created a system where fear reinforced loyalty. Historians emphasize that its effectiveness lay not in spectacle or immediate violence, but in the slow, unrelenting assertion of power. Mithridates' ordeal demonstrates both the endurance of the human spirit and the calculated ingenuity of the Persian Empire. Ancient writers preserved his story not to glorify cruelty, but to document the extremes of authority and the lengths to which rulers would go to maintain order. The legacy of this method endures, remembered as a chilling testament to how fear, planning, and psychological leverage can govern behavior across societies. The lesson of Scaphism is stark. Empires do not always conquer solely through armies or weapons. Sometimes the most potent tools of domination are patience, observation, and the carefully measured application of terror. The Persian Empire's approach serves as a historical reminder that power can be maintained not only by force but by the profound manipulation of perception and fear.